Welcome to Cipher After Hours. I'm Brett Stewart with my two co-hosts, Emily and David, and we're going to just jump in here and continue our discussion on the two crop circles that both David and I remote viewed. I think in this After Hours episode, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the ERV session work that I did, specifically on the UFO craft itself. I was tasked with, I didn't know it at the time it was a UFO, but whatever this aerial object thing is, what is it? What's the purposes of it? And how does it work? So I'll be going into some of the very strange, through my vocabulary, physics understanding of what's going on. So it's going to be an interesting one. I also got some information about the operator behind the controls, which was kind of unique. And then I think we're also going to go into some other topics, one being the Milk Hill UFO phenomenon. David has some remote viewing work that he did just serendipitously on the subject a few weeks ago. We're going to talk about and probably talk about this idea of UAPs and extraterrestrials overall, as this is a pretty good place to fit this into our roundtable discussion. So with that, Emily, maybe you could start us off and we'll jump in here.
Thanks, Brett. So there's something I'd like the listener to keep in mind as we're exploring these topics. When we're looking at a crop circle, we're not saying that it's impossible to create these patterns using all the fancy equipment we have available to us in this time. In other words, we have GPS, we have the ability to make very precise patterns in fields. What really makes these things marvelous is the time in which they happened, which is going back about 20, 30, 40 years ago, when GPS technology would have been much more limited in terms of its availability. As far as I know, it would have probably been exclusive to military use. The other thing to keep in mind is how quickly some of these things appear. In many cases, in the extreme case, the one that Brett looked at, appeared in 45 minutes in broad daylight. The Milk Hill phenomenon occurred overnight, and as far as I have heard about that situation, there was a rainstorm. So imagine being out in the fields trying to make this very complicated pattern in a rainstorm overnight. So we're not saying these things aren't possible to create, it's just they seem very difficult for humans to create under the time constraints, perhaps technological constraints, and even budget constraints, because there may not be individuals with vast sums of money to plan things months in advance and do fancy engineering. They may have just had to get out there and create these structures sort of ad hoc. So with that, I think I want to flip things over to David. David's going to give us a bit of background on his Milk Hill UFO RV session. I think part of the tasking was actually involving a UFO, so there was a bit of a baked-in result, but I'll let David take it from there.
Sure. So, yeah, this was about the Milk Hill UFO incident. That was the tasking to move close to the object captured on film, follow it, and describe in full detail activity and purpose. I found this session difficult. I was struggling to get coherent data on it, so I stopped and I asked myself, why am I finding this so tricky? And I immediately got the answer that we might be trying to look at this through a lens, which means we can't see the bigger picture. Now, how I summarized that, I said the tasking might be looking at this target through a particular lens, which is a bit of an interpretation of what's going on here, so we may not have the full picture, which, just looking at the RV work that Brett and I have had tonight on the other two crop circles, does seem to be the case, that this is not as simple as a physical craft coming along, making this pattern on the ground and then going. There seems to be all these moving parts elsewhere that are involved in this phenomenon. So I've said in my session, there is a thing or object that's complex, engineered above, but then I say it's at a place or time on Earth which is interstitial or in between other things, which I thought at the time that's a really interesting turn of phrase there. I didn't dig into it in my session in any more detail, but it just makes me think of the Oz effect, and how we've heard how these mists appear and people don't see it happening, and there's these strange effects on people's awareness and perception of these phenomena. Maybe that's alluding to that. I mean, it's not enough to say for sure, but that was the feeling I had at the time. I said there's many people here, observers. They have a vibe of like they want to take photos and put them on Instagram, but I'm not sure if this is a historically appropriate description, because Instagram wasn't around in 91, but the emotional feeling of, oh, I've got to show people my cool camcorder VHS video, that I picked up on that. And I've now seen that footage. So I said it's interesting and unusual. People are curious. But then I discovered there's an underground aspect, which I think we're going to go into all the underground stuff later, because that's like a whole different topic. But so there's an aerial phenomenon, which people are looking at and finding really interesting and cool. Visually, it looks triangular, pointing upwards. But then there's all this other stuff going on. This isn't isolated to the aerial phenomenon. So I think I'll hand it over to Brett now to see how his UFO data compares to mine, or UAP, I should say. We can't even say it's an object; it's a thing, a phenomenon. But Brett, can you tell us what it is?
Before I go into my specific data, maybe Emily knows this, or maybe you do, David, because I'm unfamiliar with the exact Milk Hill UFO phenomenon. Did people actually see something in the sky at this event? What did they see?
Yeah, there's like a light, like a point light flying about. I think there's an account of a tractor driver, and his tractor just stopped when this thing flew over him. And then there's like a old school camcorder video that was part of my feedback for this target. That's all I know about it. Emily, do you know anything more?
I think there was a farmer that was out inspecting his crops the night before. The tractor driver, I'm fairly certain, is also a report that I read where there was someone reporting sort of a light or an orb in the area. It's unclear whether it was at the exact moment the phenomenon was occurring, in other words, when the pattern was being made, or if it happened shortly before or after. But I want to say that this is a very common phenomenon in terms of the lights and the orbs appear before and after phenomenon appearing or being noticed by people. So there's a correlation. People show up at the site, they see a pattern in the ground. The pattern's already there, so it's not the act of creating it, but then they also look up in the sky and they see orbs and lights and weird phenomenon occurring with their devices, tractors, phones, etc. So all this stuff sort of happens. It's unclear whether it happens all together in real time or if it happens around the same time, but it's definitely there.
And I think this is the thing we alluded to in the main show is that there may be multiple moving parts here where unless you were to directly observe and have all the information, which no one ever does in real time in a situation that's strange or paranormal, in this case, if someone's seeing strange lights float around and orbs doing things and showing up in crops. But it's kind of the thing where I have two cats and I love them to death, but man, do they go wild for a little laser toy. And I'll move the laser around on the floor and it'll run around the corner and they just won't stop until they catch that laser. But as we know, there is no catching it. It's just a beam of light. My speculation here is, what if this is something similar? Is the thing that is actually being observed is just the end of that tool. It's not the tool itself, it's just the end of it. It's the part that hits the visual spectrum or it can be observed. Maybe it has something to do with the weather phenomenon as well. Again, I am in speculation here. And so I wonder, Dave, because you mentioned in your work, it's like not looking at the right point is what you kind of felt it's like you were looking at the laser, not at the actual laser tool itself. You're looking at the little light on the ground.
An analogy just popped into my head that if you're carving wood with a chisel, you've got the cutting end and the metal part, and then you've got a big handle to hold on to. And if we're using that as an analogy for a kind of trans-physical, paraphysical phenomenon, maybe there's just a little bit of the handle that we can see. And that doesn't follow the shape that's being made on the ground. You're just holding it and digging it about. But if we could only see a tiny little speck on there, maybe we can only see the label the manufacturer put on. That's all we can see physically. So this thing's waving about in an inexplicable manner. There's no way to connect the two. We just know whenever the wood carving turns up, the little sticker turns up. There's no relationship between them which exists in the physical. They're just both reflections of the same much bigger thing. I'm sorry that is like unbelievably woo-woo and a kind of crap analogy, but that just popped into my head.
Well, I think it leads me right into my description of what I just deem was the UFO at my site. and I think it's a good place for me to jump into describing that, because what I described is not something that's just there in the air like an airplane is there in the air. There's something very unique and strange about the craft itself. And so just to describe the data that I got, first I'll describe visually what I perceived and then the condition it was in. Is the first thing I saw is it's like it was a traditional saucer. Is it looked like you took two dinner plates, stacked one upside down on top of the other, and from a side view, that's what it looked like. It was really like a traditional saucer. There was a red light. I think there were several actually red lights towards the middle of it, and they were moving around on the inside of it. I had this overlay of something like a Cylon ship. Again, just using my lexicon from Battlestar Galactica, of some weird craft that's strange and science fiction-y. But that's what I was perceiving in the ERV session. But where it was is kind of strange, because I had that it was inside the craft itself was inside something like a vacuum. It was like here and not here at the same time. And I'm not even sure if you knew, say it had a location, which in physical 3D space, let's say it did, I don't know that for certain, if you'd even be able to see it, because I felt like it was in an envelope is what I saw it within, and it was operating from within that envelope. Now, I went in and I looked at the actual mechanism because it was part of my blind tasking after the fact. Like, I didn't know what it was, but Emily asked me to say, well, what's the mechanism of what's going on here? And it gets into some really strange, weird physics descriptions through my layman vocabulary. But I feel like this is the craft itself, and it was a craft. It looked like a UFO. It had an engine that was running, that was operating. It had an operator, but I don't think it was fully here. And I think that's a little bit, correct me if I'm wrong, David, but what you're alluded to in your work.
That would be consistent with what I said, which was just by saying that this object is here and we're looking at this object that's here, we would be missing the bigger picture. So this isn't all of it. We're just seeing a little part.
Specifically, you said it's in an in-between space.
Well, it was the place and time on Earth, which is an interstitial or in between other things. And I didn't really unpack that data any further than that. I wish I had. But I mean, it struck me as weird at the time. It struck me as like, this means something a little bit more nuanced than what I've said. But I just didn't dig into it. Easy with hindsight.
It might be a stretch, but it's an interesting corollary that I could speculate on. That I wonder if your data is alluding to this idea that I got in my ERV session work, is that the craft itself is in some kind of envelope that's not in our reality. It is in between, for lack of a better word, which is maybe why no one sees a craft literally right there above the field. They see a light, and maybe that's the end of the laser. The actual weather phenomenon is being emitted from the craft, making these circles for whatever reason, and I have speculation on that too. But just like the laser itself, we don't see that as well at these sites. Okay, so moving on to the next part of my ERV data, I was tasked with the purpose of the craft itself. And the word craft wasn't actually used in the tasking. It's just, in hindsight, that's what it ended up being. So I was looking at the purpose of it. And that's just, to be honest, it was a little bit of what's the purpose of a car is kind of the information I got. As well, it provides an outer shell for something to move through and end up in another place, like a vehicle. I was like, okay, well, that's pretty straightforward. I also was shown at the same time and I don't know if it meant literally, but I was shown an analogy of something like the Large Hadron Collider that was associated with opening a doorway for this thing to appear, and that it would take a massive amount of energy, to the degree of several nuclear blasts worth of energy, for this thing to show up here from somewhere else, because it is a transportation type of vehicle. So there is an occupant inside. But it made me wonder, as I was looking at this data after the fact and analysis, made me wonder if there was something underground here, which is what I was being shown, which is like this huge, I saw several rings. I mean, I don't know what's under the ground in these areas, but maybe, I do know the Large Hadron Collider is underground. Maybe there's something else that we're just unaware of that is in that area underground, or several miles deep, I'm just speculating here, that might be associated with this.
With regards to the underground phenomenon, I just wanted to bring up that a very large percentage of these crop circles are reported in the UK, in England specifically, but they're not random around the planet. Yes, they do occur. I don't want to make the impression that they're only in this one part of the world, but the vast majority of them occur in this one area. And the vast majority of the ones that people would call genuine or real or difficult to explain by human creation occur in this one area, that being the UK. And interestingly enough, this is just a correlation I noticed when I was looking at the data in general. It's at what we call the prime meridian, or the UTC, universal time, or where humans think of time as being the kind of the gold standard of time, and then all the time zones are plus or minus from this one area. I have no idea whether or not that matters or if that relates to this phenomenon at all. It's just super interesting to me that it seems like it's geographically bound. And if you think about this stuff being like, okay, why would UFOs care about one spot that humans care about? Maybe there's something else going on. So maybe it's geological, underground. Maybe it's tied to human consciousness because humans place value on this space. Or maybe it's something else that we can't think of. But it's certainly something that's crossed my mind as a speculation. David, do you have, actually being from the UK yourself, do you have any thoughts on what this might be, this underground stuff? You have some experience with that?
Not personal experience. It's about 100 miles west of the prime meridian line. So it's close, it's in the same time zone, but these phenomena are not like occurring on the zero longitude line, just kind of nearby. What it is close to is Stonehenge and Avebury, and the southwest of England is like ground zero for stone circles and tales of druids and King Arthur and Glastonbury, and Wales and Scotland held out longer against the kind of cultural influences coming in from Europe. So I believe the Druids were supposed to have finally carked it on Anglesey, which is just above the north of Wales. But, things were kind of pushed back and away from the direction of Europe. The Scots in particular did a very good job at avoiding that, but a huge amount of historical stuff is just lost, and all we've got is standing stones and wild speculation about them and these myths and legends that are very difficult to do anything. Well, I mean, you can do lots with them, but it's very difficult to make sense of them and say we can reconstruct this. Obviously there are reconstructionist movements, but I think there's a lot of speculation which has to go into that. But I think what we can say at a really broad level is southwestern England is full of ancient stone circles and mysterious woo-woo stuff, and it's the place to be. It's like it's like Sedona, but classier, obviously much classier than Sedona, but it's there are clusters of these phenomena, and this is one of them. So what is the mechanism by which the crop circles appear in the woo-woo cluster area of England? I really don't know. Skeptic might say, well, that's because where all the hippies live and they love to make crop circles. Or it could be a consciousness thing, or, there's all sorts we couldn't know. Maybe there is something underground, how that would relate to these phenomena we're looking at today, I have no idea, but there's a lot of things I have no idea about. I did get some underground stuff in my remote viewing session. I had an AOL of the Assyrian, the huge, deep underground structure that's near the pyramids at Giza, and it's a mystery in and of itself, that thing. I got a large chamber, a sort of square, angular chamber underground, with a little opening to the surface, and then on the bottom of that chamber, at the other side from the top opening, there was another opening that went down a little shaft into another similarly sized large angular chamber. I said, this is a special place. It's numinous, which for people who aren't huge nerds means it's kind of got a special feel. Like when you walk into a cathedral, it's got that kind of special feeling to it. Blocky, enclosing, dark inside, covered over, enclosed or sheltered. There is an object in here which is a focal point. It's aesthetic, maybe something floral in style, decorative, symbolic, and has a feeling of expansion. Meaningful, it's a symbol or beacon like a cultural touchstone or reference point. It's all quiet now. Like, this is a historical thing which is no longer current. So, what, this underground thing? Is it a temple where all these people are meeting in their meditation circle? Am I talking about Stonehenge? I had a mystical temple, ancient spiritual woo kind of feeling about it. It wasn't like an underground base, or wasn't a military bunker or something like that. But the stage 2 data, which for non-remote viewers is like the physical sensors, dimensions of things, that was really clear that it's like these two big square chambers underground. I didn't dig much more into it than this, but my overall feeling was historical ritual place. In a way, it's surprising that it's not an underground bunker with military feel, because this is near Lark Hill, which is, I believe, the UK's Area 51. That was a wartime bunker site, which has subsequently become very secretive and underground, and I'm not sure they'll even admit there's stuff going on there, but there's some urban exploration videos on YouTube where a guy goes into a quarry underground and he finds their back door with this big like concrete wall with a red security door in it and like a brand new high-tech CCTV camera above it. And he went back a second time and somebody had gone down there with spray paint and said, F off, like, don't come down here, and put the barriers back up. And that was like the fire exit from this underground base. But what I got was just an empty space. So maybe I'm being blocked. Maybe it's all related to the military activity in that area. I don't know. But Brett, can you enlighten us about what you found underground?
Well, I think this ties into what we talked about in the main show a little bit, where it's like, well, what is the reason that someone or some agency would want to keep the elements involved with this hidden? And if there is something in this geographic location, hey, I'm getting similar feelings and tones from a past session I recall, which has to do with Skinwalker Ranch. It's just different part of the world, maybe different agency, different people trying to keep things that exist as part of the natural world away from the common public because of how, well, who knows what their agendas are. What if there's something here too? There's underground, maybe ancient, maybe not so ancient, who knows how old they are, but facilities that act as, you even use this word, I believe, a beacon of some kind for things to come in. Sounds familiar again to another part of the world over in Utah, in Skinwalker Ranch. There's a beacon, and what's coming through? UAPs are showing up left and right. Emily, I know you have some research on this as far as what is exactly around here that some groups be trying to keep hidden.
Well, yeah, there's a common pattern that we see. There is a real phenomenon going on that is not convenient for the kind of mainstream narrative. And one of the easiest ways to hide this is not to say, well, there's nothing going on, but to engineer a particular situation that then you can point at and say, well, see, everything is this one thing. And in this particular case, it's like with crop circles, we have this hoax phenomenon. And there's so many people who basically just dismiss this whole topic we're covering in this entire show out of hand because they say, oh, it's all a hoax. Well, as we said in the main show, it's like, time out. Let's look at that word hoax. It's all a hoax. It's all a fake of what? You're implying you're faking something that's real. Real in this definition or in this context is something that isn't made by humans in a traditional way, like using boards wandering in a field at night. And so that the wording in and of itself leads to an immense amount of suspicion. It's like if all that this ever was people with boards in a field, hoax wouldn't make sense to even use as a word. And there are so many examples to illustrate. I won't enumerate them all here, but there's basically individuals that through either overt or covert means have been groomed or trained to go out and make these things. And when you start digging into their backgrounds and stuff, it seems like they are provoked by government agents, potentially, allegedly, to create them. And what's really mysterious is that they get to go out and make these things, get to brag about it, and there's no criminal consequences. So if you think about, you're going to go trespass in a strange person's field, you're going to ruin their crop, which is property damage, then you're going to go and tell people you did that, and you're not going to get arrested. It's like there's something going on. There's some parties that don't want to prosecute these people because they're useful. They're useful for a story that says, you see, anytime this occurs, you can easily point at these 2 people or these 5 people and say, look, they're the ones who make it. They even admit it, and they give you videos on how they do it. Nothing to see here, move on. And that's a very common theme that we have in a lot of these phenomenon, is there's an engineered explanation that satisfies most people. I know that doesn't satisfy our listenership, but most people are satisfied. They go, oh, well, there's nothing to see here because we saw it was those 2 guys with boards. They were on the show. I remember it. And I think that's part of a larger psyop, just to get us not to look into the details of this.
Well, I think it's a good point here to perhaps pivot and go back to the rest of the ERV data, because I think that lends itself towards looking at this more from a bigger picture perspective of what's going on. So in my ERV session, I describe craft itself. I described it's in this envelope of some kind. It wouldn't be a stretch to say it's like it's in between reality and not reality, is kind of my impression of it. But the purpose of the craft itself, other than interacting with something that seems underground, this is where I actually got the analogy for the Tunguska event, where it's doing something where it's flattening all the trees, was the visual I got, which, well, what is a crop circle other than all the trees getting flattened in a particular way? I also got mechanics behind how. And you'll have to bear with me a little bit. I'm not a physicist. I'm using a layman's understanding of the universe and physics. So it's just what I perceived through my own lexicon. But I thought it was a fascinating piece of RV data that you may find interesting as well. But I was tasked with describing the mechanism of how this was taking place. And what I got is that there's a point in space. And in this point in space, an enormous amount of energy is being exerted. And what it's doing is that energy is ripping apart matter in the universe. And so again, this does go back to this idea of the Large Hadron Collider, where what are we doing with that? The Large Hadron Collider is something where you throw particles in this loop faster and faster, speeding them up until you collide them together and they just shatter. And what the scientists are trying to do is understand, well, maybe if we smash, this is called a particle collider is what it's called. We smash these particles, maybe we can detect some more exotic ones that break off because of the high amount of energy that's going on. And what I described in my work is that there's some sort of device somewhere that's doing this. That's like this Large Hadron Collider, that's creating this monumental energy smashing that is actually affecting matter and reality in that space directly and is ripping it apart.
Yeah, I'm wondering, this reminds me of some different theories I've heard around nuclear weapons or nuclear reactions, that they have this similar effect where they seem to like rip reality apart, and there are non-physical, non-terrestrial entities or beings that are very concerned that we as people are doing this, because it's like, no, you don't understand. You're actually ripping multiple layers of reality, like creating this giant tear. To what extent do you think it's related to that phenomenon in general? Like, how do you think it relates to nuclear phenomenon or nuclear explosions?
Well, it's what is the consequence? And I got this in the ERV session as the information was streaming through trying to communicate what was going on. That's the starting place, is reality is being torn apart with enormous amounts of energy. The next thing I got was really out of left field, but it was this idea that it used an analogy. Just like the human body, say you get a cut or a scrape, the body is going to take the resources available to itself, bring extra blood and white blood cells, what have you, to that part of the body and repair. It's a self-repairing process. I got the idea that reality itself is hard-coded to do the exact same thing. I remember reading in the newspaper, there was all this concern a long, long time ago when the LHC was first turned on, that they were worried they were going to create a black hole by smashing these particles together in the LHC, and that the whole Earth would get sucked up into it, and everyone was terrified. It was a bunch of fear porn on this subject in the news, and hey, nothing happened. And well, I wonder if nothing happened because reality has its own mechanism of actually fixing that problem. And that's what I was getting in the ERV session, is that it's a self-repairing process.
Yeah, there are so many phenomenon that are self-dampening or repairing as opposed to run away. We're taught in school and in all sorts of different environmental phenomena that everything's run away. But if this were true, things would have already run away on us. And the way I think about it is, if you place a marble, you take a perfectly half bowl and you place the bowl in a normal way, like where you'd pour soup in it or something, and you place a marble anywhere in the inside edge of that bowl, the marble's going to settle in the middle. That's what I would think of as a self-dampening system, which seems to be very common in nature and in reality in general. We're often taught to think of things exactly opposite. So you turn the bowl upside down, so it's sort of like you couldn't put soup in it. It's sort of like a top half of a sphere. And then anywhere on there that you put the marble, it's going to fly off the edge. It's how we're taught to think about things. But it seems like in reality, quite the opposite is true.
I think the concepts of positive and negative feedback fit in here, which are from like systems design and electronics engineering and stuff. But if you think of like audio feedback, where you get a signal that just gets louder and louder and louder until something hits a limit, an artificial limit. But you got black holes, things cross a limit, and then you have this exponential thing that sucks up matter and messes up space-time, and that's I don't know, does that even count as a positive feedback system? But generally, you have negative feedback. There's an electronic engineering joke, which is I only give negative feedback, because if you give positive feedback, you have a system which goes exponential until it hits a limit. You get a system that gets stuck in one state, and then it's just broken. It's useless at that point. In your audio amplifier, you have negative feedback, right, that stops things getting out of control and keeps them operating. And we have that with the solar system and the world and the climate, everything. Because anything that does have positive feedback ends up going extreme and messed up. So when we look at extreme messed up things like black holes at the center of the galaxy, I wouldn't want to be there. That's not cool. It doesn't sustain life quite directly, but it sustains ours in a way, right?
So, Brett, how can you bring us back to going from these tears in reality that are self-healing, how that relates to these crop circles and how they get formed? Is there a connection there between tears in reality and the formation of what we see on the ground as a crop circle?
And so this is the final part of this data I have. And what I perceived is I saw this saucer looking craft, and I see as well there's a device of some kind that's creating an enormous rip in reality. And it was interesting with the way it was visually presented to me in the ERV session. It looked like there's matter and then just space, and then the space is being ripped so much that it becomes like threads as opposed to space anymore. So it was really weird to just visualize in the ERV session. So it's like it's like fabric being ripped. It's probably a visual analogy I was getting in the work. But as a result of that rip, due to the self-repairing process of reality, which also I got in the data, it needs to take matter from other parts of reality to compensate and repair it. Just like in the human body, if you get a big gash in your arm, it's probably your body is going to take blood and flood that area for the self-healing process to occur. The same thing I was getting in the session occurs with the fabric of space-time. And so that by itself, because that's a hard-coded thing, is going to create a connection from one part of reality to that space where reality is getting ripped up to shreds. And I described it as it's like opening a wormhole, but it's not a wormhole, because what it avails the craft to do is, and this is, again, I understand how this sounds, it's science fiction to the nth degree, but what this craft is able to do when that occurs is it's able to enter what I described as a slipstream, where it exits physical reality, space-time, and becomes purely information. Then since it's only information at that point, there's no worries or boundaries about speed and distance and velocity and any of that stuff. It's just purely information. And then it comes out on the other side of that wormhole and is manifested there from an informational state. So bringing it all back together, the final thing in here is that, well, you need an exit point then. Because I got you don't want to go into that slipstream without having a destination in mind, because it's like jumping in the time traveling device without putting in a year. You're like, who knows? I don't know what that would happen if you had that kind of device in the Back to the Future movie. But there is a destination, and the destination seems to be a marker. And that marker, I think, is the actual crop circle. I think the crop circle is the encoded exit point from the slipstream of information for the craft. And so it creates that, something creates that, and it's able to, like a beacon, home in on it. And then, okay, I've been uploaded into the mainframe as information. I'm no longer part of physical reality. Oh, there's the exit point in physical reality. Download the craft and the vehicle there. And therefore distance and time and nothing matters. Even it's outside, information would be outside time. You could time travel with this kind of technology. It wouldn't matter where you went or when you went because information would be everywhere. So it's like you're going outside of reality and then coming back in. And my layman understanding, not a physicist, that's what I think my work was trying to describe to me of what was going on here.
This strikes me as very similar to what we do with remote viewing, right? We have a target reference number that we get data about. We find the process works without one. We don't need it, but we have a symbol. We know that there is something which we are supposed to be remote viewing, and at some point we will get feedback about it. So there's that. Maybe that's the crop circle. And then our awareness goes through time and space, if you like, or we access information which is not bounded by time and space, which I prefer. And then suddenly that information from the past or the present or the future is right here on a sheet of paper in front of me, and I get feedback. And Emily says, wow, that was amazing. So it's kind of the same thing, or maybe not the same thing, but would you say that's a good analogy, Brett?
It is. It's a good model. It's a similar type of mechanism, except imagine as opposed to just consciousness that's doing the traveling, due to the extreme amount of energy in the technology, it's allowing physical matter, like craft, to traverse time and space as opposed to just the information.
So when you said the craft at your target wasn't quite there, is that what's doing the traveling? Is it traveled when it's in the not quite there state?
I think I was actually describing it the in-between. So it wasn't fully there yet. In my pen and paper session, I was describing it. It was still in the informational level. It wasn't physical yet. But then it was coming out of that, like out of a slipstream, and then manifesting there. But I don't think it was manifesting necessarily right 2 feet off the ground. And I have some of the other data in the ERV session did kind of specify that the thing was in space. It was in orbit. It wasn't that it was right over the ground. So I was like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. That's why no one would see it too.
It doesn't move relative to space, right? It just is in a different place.
The better description for what's actually going on here is teleportation, is that the crop circle is the laser dot for where to teleport to. And you have to go up into a buffering system of information and then re-download it at the laser dot, which is the crop circle. That's what my data is implying here.
So there is another remote viewing group that has in the past looked at the exact target that we've given David in this particular case. And this group was led by Ed Dames. And the report had some interesting findings that relate a lot to what Brett has just recently mentioned here, with there being UFOs and the phenomenon of the crop circle itself being almost like a timestamp. So it's more important of where the crop circle exists in space and time, almost like a coordinate system, as opposed to what the crop circle itself means. It's almost like a bookmark of this is a place in space-time that's relevant to the craft. There's a lot more in the report, and I think we might even link it in the show notes so people who are interested can go read it and judge for themselves what it might mean. But it's really interesting that we've got another group that has looked at this particular phenomenon that David looked at and has come to similar conclusions that Brett found in his session. Obviously, we're not the only ones who are doing remote viewing work on these topics, but there is a lot of correlation between different groups. So Brett, I know there's one final chunk of data that came out of your ERV session, and that was that there was this life form that was inside the craft. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that life form was interacting with the craft and maybe what its involvement was in the creation of the crop circle?
So the actual creation of the crop circle, I'm not sure there's a direct causal link as in the life form made it. I think it's just part of the process that the crop circle actually appears. But I did get information about it. Even in the pen and paper session, I had this astronaut type person strapped into the vehicle, an aerial vehicle somewhere that was in between space. In the ERV session, so you did task me with, okay, go look at that. And I immediately saw, I went to the craft and I ended up going inside of it, just putting my perception position there. And what I saw was something that looked like an android or a robot. It had kind of non-distinct facial features. It's like, oh, okay, well, maybe in an ERV session, usually I can speak to whatever this is. And even if it doesn't at that time, since it's a historical event, the information will react to my questions. And it was funny because when I said, hey, so I'm just curious, can you tell me what's going on here? It like turned to me to acknowledge me. I got the sense it was very disapproving and annoyed. And then I just found myself like really far away from the craft, or it had moved really far away. I wasn't not sure which was which. So I felt like it was like, I'm not interested in talking to you. I'm busy. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I won't ask you then. And so I just repositioned my perception, saying move back to the craft and just perceive. And so I did that. And so I was just watching it to describe visually what was going on. And it didn't seem to be a very large vessel, for lack of a better word. It was a single chair with a very complex dashboard in front of it, very strange looking. And there was this android robot type. It was humanoid, is at least the way I perceived it. And it was interacting with controls and seemed to almost be like on an autopilot. You know, I gotta check the engines, I gotta check this thing, I gotta check the systems and do whatever, like it was on some sort of a protocol that it was doing after an event took place. But there was an interesting element to it that I felt that there was a life form associated with this, but that wasn't actually there. And so like it was there remotely. So this android, for lack of a better word, was being operated or engaged with like a marionette from something somewhere else. And that was very weird looking. I got like it was crystalline looking. It was a very weird shape. It looked kind of amorphous. I could sketch it, but I'm not even sure which descriptions really match it other than like some strange crystal life form. I don't know. It was really weird looking. But I felt like that thing wasn't actually there, but the actual craft and the operator, the android of the craft, was doing the things for it there. And so, but the life form felt something like it was curious. It was like a scientist, like it was on a mission. It had some research to do, some data to collect, and then it was going to leave. Like nothing too crazy. It was just on like a science mission is what it seemed like. But the actual life form itself was very felt very far away is kind of how I would describe it. It wasn't there. This was a proxy for it.
So the thing that you've just described, Brett, reminds me a lot about the findings we had going back into the Bigfoot, the Patterson-Gimlin film episode, where there's a being or a manifestation or an avatar, for lack of a better word, here in physical reality, but then there are these other beings that are perhaps non-physical or very distant that are sort of controlling. They want to be here. They need a way of being here in our worlds, in our physical reality. So they manifest through these different phenomena that we see, but they're actually somewhere very distant. We don't understand if it's in a different plane of reality, if it's in a physical location that's very distant, but regardless, they need to be here, and this is their way of getting here.
So I just had a little bit of a light bulb go off in my head as you were describing that, and it's just pure speculation, but I thought it was interesting enough to share. Going all the way back to David's work, where David's describing kind of somebody who is just having potentially inspiration to do it. And there's some woo about the why. Well, why did this person get the inspiration to do this? And then you describe these kind of energetic, strange energies that are going on and kind of coalescing to urge or prompt this person to do this. And then we have the story too. You described, Emily. There's another person who they made the flower shape, and there was this other group meditating, and they wanted the flower, and the guy ended up being the manifestation of that flower in the field. What if the actors or agency involved aren't actually in this space-time dimension, but they, like you described, they want to be here, but they need to use the beings here to create or manifest the things so that they can interact here. The simplistic version of that is affecting a human to give them spontaneous thoughts. Let me go get a board and some string. I'm not saying this is in every crop circle instance, but in some, perhaps. Go make this shape because that helps aid and abet things that we're doing elsewhere. It made me wonder, are UFOs, the technology itself, also something that was created by beings that are flesh and blood here that were inspired by beings that aren't, to help facilitate them entering into our physical reality? Because it doesn't make sense that a being that isn't in this physical reality could just, well, how are they getting the technology here to then allow them to operate? Is it that there's actually groups out there that are unwittingly being inspired to create this technology, which then actually is now being controlled by things that aren't from around here. And so there's this weird relationship. It's an intertwined relationship between the organic beings and the non-physical beings, which would explain the UFO phenomenon. What if the UFOs actually are made by humans? It's just humans that don't realize they're being manipulated by life or consciousness that's not physical. Big speculation, but it was just like a really big light bulb.
So, Brett, I think something outside of time and space has inspired you to describe what is a conspiracy theory about the Large Hadron Collider. I'm going to be generous and say I'm not sure I buy this, but the story goes that the scientists and all the huge institutional effort behind the LHC are being secretly controlled by demonic entities who wish to control them in order to do this. And I honestly don't buy it. Nothing bad ever happened since they switched that thing on. I'm still here. No black holes, no portals, no Satan. So I don't buy it, but I think it's an example of a reflection of something that does happen, because I know in my own experience, myself and others, that non-physical things that are woo-woo can most definitely have influences on people and cause outcomes. So I think that is a legit angle to look at it from.
The thing that was missing in my hypothesis was the why would you need to do a psyop? There's no motive, because it's like, okay, there's some aliens coming here. Let's just say hypothetically it's an alien. I don't know. But it's a craft coming here, it's traveling here. I'm someone in a position of power. I need to hide this from the people so they don't figure out these are aliens. Well, why? Like how is that? Oh, because people can't handle it. I don't buy that. That's a stupid reason. I think that's a red herring. What if the reason that you need the psyop, the reason why it's so hidden, the reason why it's like we can't let people know about this is because the craft is actually being made by humans so that it can be controlled by something not from around here. That there's this symbiotic relationship between different parts of society and who knows what other parts of other societies to allow the interaction of beings that are non-physical to operate. I understand this is a wild hypothesis speculation, but it felt like the puzzle piece fit, at least. So it was interesting to think about, at least.
So what you've been discussing has brought to mind a popular sort of cultural reference or a movie that I'm sure much of our audience has seen. It's going back a number of years. It's called Contact. And in this Contact movie, the alien life actually causes humans to build a device that allows the humans to travel to see the aliens, or allows the humans to connect with the aliens in some way. So the best way to actually create contact between alien races is to teach humans to build stuff through effectively a signal, but this could happen not through a physical signal, even a download, and then the humans create something that then allows them to connect to the aliens. All this stuff comes to mind as you're discussing this theory you have, Brett, and it's very interesting that we have a pop cultural example.
This is alleged about the Thule Society before and during World War II, with Nazi occultists channeling the designs for UFOs, and this is part of that whole space Nazis on the moon conspiracy thread, which again, I don't know, maybe, but there's certainly long-standing documented allegations that Thule Society members channeled UFO blueprints. Whether these are really supported, I don't know.
I think my work doesn't directly say that. I just think it was all the ingredients were there to put together. And so it kind of just clicked. So it's likely, if that's true, it's going to be more nuanced than this, I am sure. And it may also not be every instance. It may only be some instances. But I do think it was an interesting little light bulb that I had. So take it for what it is.
Yeah, the question, what is going on here, almost subtextually assumes that it's one thing, doesn't it? So we may not be aware of the fact that we're looking for one thing when we set out to answer that question, but on some level, that's what we want. We want an explanation that fits in one sentence. And we can say, well, we can tell you it was aliens from the future. Mystery solved. Tune in next week. Also, I want to apologize to our listeners because I made an error earlier when I was talking about UK secret military bases. The one with the underground access is actually Rudloe Manor, I believe, not Lark Hill. But this is still like 20, 30 miles away. There's a lot of military secret stuff in that area, and I'm not an expert at it by any means, but I got my secret bases mixed up. I do apologize.
So, David, does that mean that we've got 4 episodes in one? Because while we thought we were doing a show on crop circles, we secretly did a show on 4 different things?
Yeah, so we've talked about it being multiple things and not just one thing, but actually, even when we say it's multiple things, that's still putting those individual things into their own category. We're still categorizing. We've just fallen into a more subtle level of the trap of categorizing. And these things, I suspect, blur together. They're not, okay, here's the non-physical thing, here's the human, here's the UAP phenomena, here's the reality thing. I suspect that in some way that I absolutely am not capable of grasping, these do blur together. And you get this idea in Buddhism, interestingly, don't you? That oneness, essentially, that the separation between things is illusory. And it's not a big leap to extend that out of the purely physical or mental realm into these broader woo-woo things. But, why should that rule not apply there too?
So with that, I think we're going to put a conclusion or a bookmark in the chapter of UFOs and aliens for the time being and wrap up this episode. We do appreciate all of our subscribers immensely. Thank you for supporting us and joining us on this journey. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you'll join us on our next one. We go down a different rabbit hole, kind of explore what's there through the lens of remote viewing, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.